Chapter 8 focuses on community. In particular, the chapter discusses impacts on social networks, stigma, mobility, crime and law, trust, mass protests, impacts on media, and also elections. And this chapter has the least amount of meta-analysis data, but it has a number of really high-quality multi-country studies and also international reports on these topics. Non-pharmaceutical interventions created a shock to social networks, social support, interaction, day-to-day routines, and meaningful life events. It increased stigma at a population level. One meta-analysis estimates 35% of people experienced some form of stigma in 2020, highest among healthcare workers, those who had or were recovering from COVID, and individuals with lower socioeconomic status. We also have multiple qualitative systematic reviews showing how long-term care facility policies or efforts to restrict access to funerals by having virtual funerals or limiting the number of people who could attend them had adverse psychological and social impacts. Social relationships are hard to measure, and so we have a lack of systematic reviews in many of these areas. But we do have strong data showing that the efforts to connect online did not address the increase in loneliness. Social and friend networks decreased, especially for young people. A belongingness gap opened up, including among the elderly. We had a heightened xenophobia, especially for Asians, young people, and individuals who did not comply with the various mandates and rules that were put into place. We also saw a loss of autonomy and what I call social essentialism. So the idea that all elderly people were vulnerable and needed to self-isolate, or that young people were spreading the infection and acting as vectors, endangering their grandparents. And this discourse, this public discourse, led to moral panics where the population was divided into two, a virtuous majority versus the non-conforming minority who were endangering people's health. We saw politicians scapegoat different groups of people throughout the crisis. This practice varies tremendously based on socioeconomic, cultural, and political norms around the world. One aspect of COVID policies were international travel restrictions. And we actually saw over 100,000 different travel restrictions imposed in 2020 and 2021. Now, this actually decreased global immigration, which had a negative impact on migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and also international students. The research on mobility patterns in general show that efforts to limit mobility by staying at home or having other government mandates were only effective for short periods of time. So this is often using Google phone tracking data, which shows that mobility patterns will reduce for about 3 to 6 weeks after a stay-at-home order, and then it goes back to normal. They also show that people of lower socioeconomic status, often the essential workers, their mobility reduction is actually even less. And depending on the study, it does call into question actually the effectiveness of lockdown policies on limiting mobility at a population level. We also saw what's been called an urban exodus. So this is especially in Europe and North America, people leaving the cities, the downtown cores, and going to the countryside, going to the suburbs. There's a number of large-scale studies in the US and in Europe showing that this urban exodus has not returned to pre-pandemic levels even in 2022. And that's obviously having a huge impact on the economy of downtown cores, especially in American cities. We do not have any systematic reviews bringing together the various studies on crime and law during the pandemic. One large-scale multi-country study found actually that there was a reduction in police-reported crime during the lockdown period of about 37%. But then this reduction in crime increased as soon as lockdown was lifted. Other scholars question this type of data because they're depending on police-reported crime. So what about crime that wasn't reported to the police? In some countries, that actually reduced during the pandemic. Other studies actually show an increase in certain types of crime during lockdowns. In the United States, homicide rates actually increased if you compare 2019 to 2020 and 2021. About 6,000 excess homicide deaths occurred during those years. Studies from India and from Nigeria suggest an increase in property crime and also missing persons cases during the COVID crisis period. Crime migrated online. People engaged in more cybercrime activities, and this includes an astronomical amount of fraud around the historic government spending programs. Some studies in the United States estimate that 10 to 15% of the trillions of dollars spent by government were misappropriated by fraudsters. There was also historic lows in efforts by governments to fight public sector corruption, as discussed in a Transparency International report. Pandemic policies also criminalized certain types of social behavior and expanded police powers to arrest and fine the public for non-compliance. So again, we don't have a review available on this topic, but there are a number of large international reports that give us a glimpse of how large of an issue this became. An Amnesty International report from 2020 documents police abuses in over 60 countries around the world, including the alleged detaining of 85,000 people for non-compliance with curfews in the Dominican Republic alone and 100,000 in the Philippines. The Policing the Pandemic Mapping Project in Canada found over 10,000 police enforcement incidents across the country in the first half of 2020 related to COVID fines, totaling an estimated $13 million, specifically related to breaking social distancing rules. Studies from Argentina, Nigeria, and Australia highlight increases in resistance to authority arrests, growing distrust of police, and also concerns about police discrimination and corruption. Other effects from pandemic policies on crime and law include disruption to the legal system, including creating backlogs in the court judicial system that are going to take years to recover from. We also see deterioration in the prison system. So less than 6% of the global prison population benefited from any efforts during the first COVID wave to promote decarceration to prevent infections in prisons. Studies have shown a severe deterioration in global prison systems in 2020, including increases in solitary confinement and prison riots. Trust has been a central concept during the COVID crisis, although there's only one early review on the subject of trust in COVID. And actually, most research is focused on the correlates of trust for compliance and disease control, rather than looking at longitudinal social trends in trust between citizens, trust between citizens and the healthcare system, and also between citizens and the government. There are actually some pretty significant methodological problems with measuring trust. And so the research data is patchy and varied. But despite this, there are some general patterns that we can discern. One meta-analysis of studies on trust, focused exclusively on high-income countries, found that the number of people who said that they have high trust in their government increased by 4% in 2020 to 44%. But at the same time, the number of people who strongly supported democracy decreased by 4% to 65%. What we saw in the trust studies is congruent with what's called a rally around the flag effect. People in a circumstance of uncertainty and fear and threat tend to rally around their countries, experts, and governments. And this is what happened. There are some studies that actually parcel this out and show that fear was a very strong contributing factor to building trust in authorities during that time. But what we saw in the trust literature is, as time went on in 2020, there was a decrease of trust. People had questions that weren't being answered. They had concerns about socioeconomic impacts. And these are also associated with certain psychological temperaments and also political affiliations. We've also seen an increase in social polarization, also something that's tricky to measure, and we don't have any good systematic reviews on this topic. One large study on social polarization across more than 20 countries found that 61% of respondents, and this is mostly in high-income countries, said that social polarization had increased because of the pandemic. And of course, there's a large body of research on conspiracy theories. However, there's a lot less research on censorship and also mistakes made by governments, including mistakes in communicating risk, communicating uncertainty to the public. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which tracks different forms of violence around the world, protests increased by 3% in 2020 and by 11% in 2021. And about 20% of these protests were COVID-related, people protesting against COVID restrictions. We also saw many countries, in fact, over 80 countries, postpone elections in 2020 due to concerns about viral spread and other factors. 60% of these elections, when they did occur again, had a lower voter turnout, with about 10% average reduction. How did the pandemic affect voting? It's a very fascinating area of research. There's various results, and there's no comprehensive review on this subject that was available. But some studies, for example, in the United States and France, show that voters tended to rally around the incumbent politicians who they saw were safe and would help protect them from the virus. However, this came with side effects. A lot of psychological studies show an increase in authoritarian attitudes, a public acceptance of more authoritarian governance. Hello, Kevin here. Thank you for watching the series to date. If you missed any of the episodes, you can find a link in the description to the full series. In the penultimate episode, video 9, I'll be discussing COVID policy impacts on the environment and ecosystems, touching upon the subjects of pollution, wildlife, forestry and fishing, and plastic waste. Please like and subscribe to this channel for regular updates from me and to be among the first to find out about the work we are doing here at Collateral Global.